Okay, notice this as what we would call a Eurasian steppe horse, or what some people now in modern vernacular would probably call a Mongolian steppe horse. But if we just capture this moment here that's going on, this is of course a modern photograph. But if we go back in this exact same area not too long ago, as we've shown in many times, that wouldn't necessarily have been a Mongolian riding on there, but they have found people with double fur coats and so on that are attached to this and riding horses. In fact, just to expound before we even get into this video about how you could take this situation much deeper, for I've done a few videos recently about horses, cowboys, people in covered wagons going west, the whole 9 yards. This horse has some hairy hooves on him, and if you'll look over his body, he has a coarser and perhaps longer hair, almost a woolly effect, than most horses that you would see. A little bit fuller tail and perhaps a mane too, but also he has hair under his chin. In fact, hybrids of this forms and other forms bred one way left and the other right, and then crossing back together in a hybrid form, much like people did eventually through Neanderthal and those other things that we talk about, ended up showing up as old as early cave paintings of Cro-Magnon and way back when. And in a modern sense, this same horse hybrid in that situation I spoke out before in selective breeding and all of these other things over time has brought us a horse like a Clydesdale and something that is much a workhorse, whereas you would think of this as somewhere between a pony, like a Welsh pony, and a quarter horse style. But over time, thoroughbreds and all of the different breeds, just like dogs and its myriad of different forms, have been bred, and there's Shetland ponies and miniatures now and all kinds of things that happen. They've even made fake unicorns by breeding a certain type of Angora goat and then taking where its horns or horns would come out and surgically putting them in the middle, and as they come out, twisting them, and the thing ends up with a unicorn. But there's depictions of Tuatha Danann, who were taking these hybrided horses I spoke of a moment ago, and even in a war horse fashion, blanketed up and so on, had headdresses and they had singular horns on them. Well, they already had a mythology about unicorns, and you are aware of it today. And then, of course, biblical ideas and the strength and incredible massiveness of this ancient unicorn used to be the old woolly rhino that had this unicorn effect, in fact, leading into the one-horned rhino and the only one left. This guy's in a saddle that really hasn't changed much in thousands of years, as we talked about in the other videos. But if we look past him, we see evergreen trees and an area of rock that appears to be worked right behind him. And I wonder what else you could find, like these trees that are knocked off behind him. And in a grove of trees that are pretty large, some have been selectively in a round situation over here to the right of the horse's head, been taken off, and it looks like a long time ago. One wonders how long ago. For in ancient times, these people living off the land, and as elves did and so on, would pick up places like this and build a house and have certain situations. In fact, use some of these stumps and line them up, especially if they lined up. There's evidence that they selected such places. Well, the people that heralded civilization that we talk about frequently are not bound to one genetics, but we're going to talk about a majority through this article of one people who definitely were part of that situation and what we talk of currently as proto-Indo-Europeans. Let's go ahead and get into this here. We're talking about how a handful of Yamnaya culture nomads became the fathers of Europe. Now, Yam is important, and we'll talk about this later, but Yam was known to many ancient cultures who these people came down into as having to do with the sea, But strangely, that didn't have to do with necessarily the ocean. There is a difference between a sea and an ocean, but then later with the seven seas, ah, let's just get into it. The origins of modern Europeans are shrouded in mystery and wrecked by controversy. Archaeologists and linguists have long debated the origins of the Indo-European language family, as well as the origins of civilization and settled life in Europe and elsewhere. Recent discoveries past years suggest that the origin of European culture, as well as some Central Asian cultures, is within the archaeological culture called the Yamnaya. In fact, there are other cultures that are attached to ones that came out of this cultural group that dealt with people in the Far East, Southwest, Southeast, around the entire Mediterranean. In fact, looks like they had many interactions with people that would also become of the Americas, and many people believe that these same people, long before we were believing the American Indians had come over to America, a type of them that came through because of iconography and stonework that looks like conspicuously hooked up with them over time, not as far back as we're looking, but into a modern time and people that were connected with them. The migration of genes versus migration of ideas. One major source of contention over the origins of precursor to modern European cultures is over whether they involve the movement of actual people or merely the exchange of ideas. Before about 9,000 years before present, Europe was still in the Paleolithic. It was populated largely still by hunter-gatherers, living not very differently from how they had lived when they first arrived in Europe roughly 37,000 years ago. That number's a little changed now. Cro-Magnon at least goes back 50,000 years. So I don't know why they're pegging it on the 37 exactly on that. But perhaps the better stone cultures that came out of that peg around 34 to 37,000 years ago, that's where they're getting it from. Beginning around 9,000 years before present, however, agriculture and village life began to spread across Europe, and by 5,000 years before present, the continent was mostly settled by Neolithic farmers. Around 5,000 years before present, or 3000 BC, a Bronze Age culture began to spread across Europe, probably from the steppes of Eurasia. I have another video loaded up, and it's about David Reich and doing a talk not too many years ago about this same situation and other findings, and inside of a total talk by taking this section out of it, and then whenever he finally goes on to this further section of it after going off left field a little bit, we can see him talking about this same situation and how early people were easily seen differentiated from each other because of differentiation, but also slight mixes that were different from each other, but relatively the same people, almost like cousins. But also by nomenclature, one of them ended up bringing farming alive. Yet another one was shortly after, seemingly to bring about horses, wheels, and things like that, which swept across, again left or west, and ended up bringing about the European cultures, which are a hybrid of these individual people. But much like a Conan the Barbarian, or if you will, if you take the mythology we looked at and who the elves were and brownies and all this, that, and the other, ended up becoming the mix. And two snakes coming together are rebiting its tail, and we talked about before in the same situation. Let's continue as it gets deeper into it. In one view, this change is related to trade networks that existed across Eurasia. Oh yes, well predating what you think of as the Silk Road and so on, but people of Europe were in trade contact with the people of the Middle East and Eurasian steppes, and they adopted the technology and life ways of more technology advanced outsiders in a rippling effect. And I've got this and I've got that. You know, I've got peanut butter, I've got jelly, I've got chocolate. Wow, oops, my peanut butter, my chocolate went in your peanut butter. Or did my peanut butter go into your chocolate? Does that leave jelly out? Hell no, it don't. Look at bread. You know, one thing I thought of, it was amazing. Just the other day, I was able to have a Philly cheesesteak sandwich, and oh, aren't they incredible? If you haven't had one, I suggest you get it in the way that you like. I don't like as many onions as bell peppers as most people, but it's all about the bread too, and everything all together in one. But how long ago we talked about Cowboys and all these different things? How long ago was there Philly cheesesteak style of things? Well, there were definitely a people that had capturing cattle and doing so on that we've talked about, that at least inside of 23,000 years were making bread that we found out, right? And these same people at about 1805 were definitely known as making milk products. In fact, cheese and things like that are anciently found. So, short of having an onion perhaps, but maybe some other garnish or bell pepper and some other seasoning, which have been found going way back. And people say now, well, Neanderthals even and so on, and it goes back over 100,000 years, people at least doing something rather than going straight with their food and seasonings. So how long does a Philly cheesesteak go back? Well, having bread with meat on it and the cheese, perhaps you just fold it up into it and go with it, and damn, ain't that good, I'll have another one. Goes back, oh, many, many thousands of years. In one view, this exchange, though, is related to these trade networks we talked about, and it says it's loading. Oh, it's going to try to do it. The original position of many European archaeologists, however, is that the second instance, at least, not first, represented an invasion, perhaps. In 3000 BC, now again he said second, as we've talked about before, nomadic pastoralists from the steppes of Eurasia replaced and interbred with Neolithic farmers who had settled Europe about 4,000 years earlier. So there was a wave at least 4,000 years earlier, at least 7,000 years, that had spread out from sites that we were looking at that originally started at Göbekli Tepe. In a modern day, we think of that. Some of those sites are showing back a little older, and yeah, it goes back earlier. Then we have Kamyana Mahila at 22,000 BC. We have this other place down here that's so near Jordan, and that shows bread being made at 3,000, as we talked about before, and this other ancient mortar and pestle and things and bran type breads being made by these people around this same time. Way the hell over here. More recent views also contend that Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, began to spread across Europe around 7000 BC without much interbreeding with the native hunter-gatherers. This suggests that both may have been the result of actual migrations of people. Again, I'll interject that until we had modern genetics, we were going off pottery shards and whether they had much interaction or a lot, or did these people come over and see that and just start mimicking it, and what happened? Now we know through genetics. Oh no, we're pretty sure on this one. And it's interjection. So if you want to talk about silly things like halflings, half-elf people, and so on that went off, I've got a video that's going to talk about it, and it's going to strange. It looks like some scientist talking all about it, but I'll be damned if that's not what he's actually talking about if you go through the mythology and things I unlaid in this year. There's another layer to it too, by the way. I'm letting that simmer. Although there are still many unanswered questions, sequencing of ancient human genomes has revealed that these culture changes in Europe were partially a result of a migration of people. The earlier migration of farmers from Anatolia and the Near East is beyond the scope of this article, and you don't want to hear me go off. Seriously, I've got videos about it. But recently, research suggests that the dawn of the Bronze Age Europe was due to the expansion of this Yamnaya culture. And it goes from, like they say, 7,000 BC, and a pinpoint here in parts of it is about 6,400 BC as I've talked about. And within 100 years, there's a few places impinged upon in a few different directions, some of them for the first time. Recent studies over the years have revealed that most Central and Northern Europeans, as well as some groups in Central Asia, are descended from this Yamnaya culture. It appears that beginning around 2800 to 3000 BC, the Yamnaya moved out of somewhere in modern-day Western Russia, around the Black Sea and Caucasus region, or the Ukraine also, and began to move into the plains of Central Europe. Well, actually, it was separate different groups, and one went this way and one went that way, and you take the high road and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before you. Well, not if you go that way. Oh, damn, how'd you beat me? Let's continue. Here we're looking at a few things in this map, and so we see the expanse of the Yamnaya culture, but we've also talked about the Dolmen culture, which is just showing up this small amount here over the top of Black Sea region that's there, and how it went around, and the Kyotafini culture, and a few others that we've talked about. But then also there is this CWC, this corded ware culture, that actually everybody talked about. Well, this was this and that was that and da da da, and it's like, no, the people that were there got ran over and intermingled with these people, and it kept going. Will they stay there? No, they went left. A whole lot left. But then there's another group, because if you look here at the Northern Caucasus culture with the leading ways through, just like through the Alps, and the Kura-Axis culture, and Anatolia, and this place, they're right about in here. Noah landed on his little boat there that we all talk about a lot of times, but let's not get into that necessarily. But hey, a lot of you should be able to be making connections. For we also talked about Isaac and Kurgan burials and so on, and how it gets carried over in this ideal. And then there's the other side of here where people don't look at it, and how it came down to here, but also went much farther to the right and down to the edge here. Different people and language, and all of these things are shown from it. And there's always been a debate on whether or not, well, these people, they went down here and back up here and over there, and then they ended up here. And it's like, no, but yeah, kind of like that. Sequencing the human genome has made it much easier to trace human migration, since different populations will have characteristic genes which can then be used to track migration routes. Eurasia has hundreds of different ancient human genomes that can be stored in order to decipher past migration within Eurasian populations. More ancient genomes to sequence means more data and thus higher resolution results. Like whenever they get an ancient Kurgan burial and they're able to do the DNA on it and show you, oh yeah, this is early European hunter-gatherers here, or this is this, or this is that. But also their genomes that are in that, and then later it says, oh, well, there's a mix over here, but they have that genome. That apparently, if you look over here, is at least predominantly within this one culture, so one could infer here they are, not just some piece of pottery. And a whole lot more if you keep going. One interesting aspect of the Yamnaya migration is that it seems to have consisted mostly of men. The genetic evidence suggests overwhelming Yamnaya men intermarried with European women to create some modern European populations, particularly the people of the Central and Northern Europe. The Yamnaya also appear to be behind the corded ware culture. But they say predominantly men here intermarrying there, and there's a point in there where you get this idea the sons of God found the women pretty. But when we talk about that happening over here and the mixing that I talked about recently, and I'm about to show you in that David Reich type video, in the same suggestion, it was done to a portion in a lot of other cultures that I should probably just go on about. But 37,000-year-old bone reveals surprising connection between ancient and modern Europeans. What's that all about? Well, like I say, distant cousins getting back together. For at one point, they were kind of all together, and the linguistics shows you that the connections between them go back to this point. In fact, there's another point of linguistics that people have studied that go back another point than this that actually contain pretty much all the known linguistics in the ancient world back to a singularity of point, with an exception of a few. Here we see a piece of expression of corded ware, and if you'll look at it closely, it's like somebody took some bissel type of rope that's twisted and run through its thing like braids and is run it around on it using designs. There's a lot of times there's lips on the vases and so on, but this also shape of the vase is real common and going through a lot of people, and variation on a theme. But once genetics is all looked at, it's not like they found it and made it a little different. It's like them and the locals together formed variation on a theme. The Yamnaya crossed enormous distances, likely because of newly domesticated animal at the time, the horse. Horses were domesticated sometime before 3000 BC, and it looks like it goes way the hell back. There are some cave paintings that people said, oh yeah, all this stuff is around 22,000 years old, and they go, well, here's a guy on a horse. Got a video about it, but so at what point were they domesticated whole hog or anything situation? What's going on? Well, at the first knowings of domesticated horse, people have not only looked at the people that are there with these horse burials, but looked at the horses and they go, well, this is a little bit over this way, kind of a horse. This one looks a little more like that, and this one's more like the original. Well, these are more like this, a little bit. In fact, here they are all of a sudden showing up in more Western Europe, and they're a little more like this style and this style. Oh wait, there's one down in Persia that looks very much like that, but a little bit more, what the hell? Hey, just like dogs, a lot of changing going on. From a horse that, through the last ice age, became somewhat diminuted. Yeah, it's kind of like island trap syndrome, if you will, but not even on an island. Well, all of Europe is a giant island, especially whenever you squinch things down and cut down areas that people can live in. And that happened to some people where it didn't happen to others because of advantages and so on. We talked about giants, but let's just continue here. One of the earliest material cultures associated with domesticated horse species is this bow tie culture. Yeah, they wore little bow ties and stuff, real cool. Some of them polka dotted, some of them, no, I'm just kidding. The domestication of the horse would have given nomadic groups more mobility, allowing them to go greater distances. It'd be as if they suddenly had been given a car. Well, I made the confrontation that, yeah, it's kind of like a car, and you'd say, well, a horse is just a car, but once they have this chariot on wheels, now all of a sudden they actually have a mobile home. In fact, a lot of these yurts, they ended up putting on these giant wheels and took them far places. We, again, talked about recent Cowboys and how far that goes back, and they go, oh, the Wild West. And they go, Wild West of what? Rethink that again. Well, boots and hats and all that, all a little bit different hats, but yeah, here's some hats. Here's the boots. Here's this. Here's a saddle and an old bit. Here's some cave paintings. What the hell? How far does this go back? Got a video on it. Let's just continue. Other simultaneous migrations. In studying human migration, scientists did not only find evidence of human migrations in genomic studies, but also the migrations of disease. And in fact, a lot of times they were looking for this type of situation, and they're trying to find out, hey, does this kind of thing go with these people more than these? But also they find out, well, these people had it first, and then it shows up here. Therefore, we can infer that they had interaction. And it's like, no, we're looking at genetics here. It's a little more than what somebody would say interaction, under quotes. Scientists have tracked the spread of viruses in human populations. One example is hepatitis B virus, or known HBV. Through investigation, ancient genomes, scientists were able to track how the viruses followed human populations over the course of history. They also discovered at least one extinct HBV genome. I want to look at that. It's a different article and everything, but it's like, okay, somebody had this, and then those people that had that didn't make it. Did it screw them up that bad? What's the inferration? But The Yamnaya and other ancient Eurasian populations have helped scientists understand not just human history, but also the history of human viruses. The Yamnaya culture and society, though. What is known about the Yamnaya is mostly known from archaeology. The term Yamnaya comes from the Russian expression Yamnaya kultura, which means pit culture, basically. This is because of the types of graves that they left behind. We've shown quite a few of these. Red ochre associations, all kind, even ancient Amazonian women, and so on. The Yamnaya were nomadic pastoralists who originally lived in the steppes of Eurasia before moving west. One thing has been suggested about the Yamnaya is that they are responsible for the concept of property being owned by particular families and transmitted only to individuals within those families. Well, a lot of people have said, well, there's one concept that it appears to be going on through them in a passed down lineage type situation rather than all for one or anything like that. But a lot of people have inferred, of course, a lot of this is under conjecture and so on, that they had a lot more than that to go on with culture that seems to have been lacking a little over here. Then all of a sudden they seem to show up with it. At the same time, there's this pottery kind of involved, and maybe they know genetics shows, no, that's exactly what the hell happened. One of the greatest migrations of all time, and it's not some butterflies like monarchs, but it led to the great monarchs. Oh, snap. You know, the monarch butterfly is Danae. Yeah. Makes you think of Danids. Now they had nymphs and things that went along with that, and little fairies that are really like butterflies, but I digress. The Yamnaya were nomadic pastoralists, though, and they seem to pass on a lot of their culture from hand to hand and so on, and dating back to the time we have before a lot of the civilizations where we know that things like this went on, like in Egypt, who really became gods and passed it along to princes who became kings but were a god and seen as such in the eyes of the people, but not just there, in Samaria and in other places. Before the arrival of Yamnaya, European tombs were large and communal and appear to have belonged to more than one family. Yamnaya tombs, however, consist of more individual grave sites. This also may have been related to the nomadic lifestyle of the Yamnaya. More mobility would have allowed for less time for the development of large multi-family communities as such clans, and actually planting crops and then moving out of season to be able to move back into it in season and have it already ready up for you, and a naturality worked pretty well for them. And of course, coming out of a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where they could chase something, once they ran all the deer off from this side of mountain, they kind of had to go to the next one. If they started finding a lot there and none back here, everybody uprooted and moved around through the next pass and onto the next one and cleared out the area next to them and did it again. Then all of a sudden, back there is back good. Oh yeah, all those plants are coming up, should be ready. Let's head back. And so many movements. Somebody who's ever studied the American Indians could understand where there are ones that went through larger movements and ones that went through many movements like this. They didn't necessarily have horses hooked up to carts and so on, but it's something very similar. Birds migrate for situations like this. Not just the weather, but all things that are involved, but let's not go there. But more mobility would have allowed for less time for the development of large multifamily communities as such clans, and also the graveyards wouldn't have been as large, but there would have been a lot more of them, but you would probably never have noticed it unless it was near another ancient one. Out of reverence, they didn't necessarily put it so close to it, but we can see things that like Stonehenge, and then over here there's one, and ones that are near it, and over there there's one, and then one's kind of near it, and one's kind of near it. But then you have to find a lot of these things, and all of a sudden there are hundreds being found of these things that people didn't even know really existed. But you get up on a little drone or use satellite photography, and they're like, well, what's this? Here we see a culture, and this guy is on his right hand side, but facing to the east. This is pretty much north on the stick, as you see here, I'm guessing. But if you notice, the ground around it seems to have a more orange effect, and I don't know if they realized that there was a red ochre layer in here associated with this whole thing, but chances are there were. We've seen a lot of burials, and so it was. If this is the one I'm thinking of, and 93 doesn't strike it to me whatsoever, but I've seen a lot of these, and of course they walk around taking pictures from slightly different angles. This is a guy they figured out was like over 6'4", just off doing simple measurements of him and going, wow, this is a pretty big dude here. The Yamnaya were also the first, or one of the first, Bronze Age cultures in Europe. Their use of bronze and copper may have given them an advantage over the mostly Neolithic Stone Age inhabitants of Europe at the time. It has been suggested that European women may have found them Yamnaya men more desirable for marriage because of their prowess as warriors and their superior technology. There may have been a give and take going on there, but then a folding in of people, and so a continuation of both as one. This gets taken into mythology and a layer of those things that we talked about with elves and so on. And then there was another wave and another one, and they together formed a mythology that really talked about themselves and what had happened. I kind of went into depth of it earlier this year. Hopefully you've seen some of the videos. The Yamnaya who invaded Europe appear to have been mostly male. The male to female ratio may have been as high as 14-1. Because of this, it's not unreasonable to suggest that the Yamnaya men coming into the region were mostly warriors. It is unlikely, however, that this was a part of an organized invasion. Nonetheless, the movement into new lands may have been intentional. And then here we go again with a biblical kind of concept where all these things and people have to deal with, oh, the Nephilim and these giants and these things happen and da-da-da. And you go, well, this is the only reality that goes along with that. And in fact, out of a lot of connections we've made over the last few years, that's it. Here's a picture of one of these Yamnaya cultures, and this is nowhere near my favorite, for this almost looks like Truman Capote or something, or a few others perhaps. Maybe a little bit Greek and so on too, with the hair pulled a little forward in the way that it looks. Bear claws, though, in the necklace that's been found with the body that was associated with this, and this is artist rendering. It's possible that the reason for this migration was found colonies that were politically and culturally aligned with the homeland to expand their culture and their family hoardings to new lands. At this point, you might kick in the starting of the original Conan movie. This would make their purpose similar to the Greek and Roman colonies established across the Mediterranean. It's possible that they could have been raiders intending to become rich from plunder and gain glory in battle to establish their place in their society, similar to the later Vikings. In fact, I'll be damned if you checked it out. Some of those people we're talking about now, the Yamnaya culture, ended up becoming the Danes and these people that's, well, there's the Vikings? Yep. But also it has a connection to ancient Phoenicians and their boats and everything too. Yeah, take the high road and the low road again. Here we go. The Yamnaya lifestyle appears to have been a mixture of pastoralism, agriculture, and hunting and gathering, which is similar to the lifestyles of later European cultures, such as the Celts and early Germanic cultures. This makes sense since these recent findings would suggest that Germanic people and the Celts were their descendants. Also, there are the Picts that were involved with this too, in the ancient of times, along with elves and so on that we talked about that come in later waves. Anglo-Saxons, yeah, Jutes, and so on. The Yamnaya and Proto-Indo-European. It's hard, if not possible, in many cases to determine the language associated with an archaeological culture unless they have translatable written records that have been preserved. The language spoken by an ancient society leaves no trace of itself in the archaeological record. Despite this problem, there are always ways to determine the language most likely spoken by an archaeological culture. The spread of Yamnaya genetic influence across Europe and cultural Asia through the roughly matches the spread of Indo-European languages. It's what we used to call Aryan languages. But if you just step back Old English one step, you'll find that it has a lot of connections with ancient Germanic languages and so on. Before the Romance language type thing came in, you step it back another notch and they're connected, and of course it's back to these ancient cultures in here. You step it back another notch and they would have been able to all speak to each other. Now, we don't know what the ancient culture is of the people far east and far west of the variation of this, but later when it comes into it, it does envelop all of it. So if there was ever a time, it's that biblical Babel situation going on, there's that point in time. Doesn't go with the story quite well though, does it? But then again, if you think it out, whenever they're trying to incorporate all the tribes and things they talked about in every situation that went on, here's one. Here's another one. Oh yeah, they also scattered and had different languages now and all kinds of stuff. These people that were working together to make, yeah, it makes more sense whenever you do it that way. Pardon me. The origin of the Indo-European language is another field fraught with contention, though, and controversy. The two main views are that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European, all the hypothetical ancestors of these Indo-European languages, were either Anatolian farmers who began to expand from their homeland in 7000 BC, or these pastoralist nomads from the steppes of Eurasia who began to spread out from their homeland at 4000 BC. And I say, no, yes, no, yes. In fact, you've got to step it back one point before that, and those people are actually, well, through that, are the same people. So here's a European, Eurasian steppe nomads and their cattle and things that go on in a range with some mountains that went on there. And let me tell you, there are connections with where the sun sets and goes through mountains and all these things, connections we found. In fact, if you were just to take a drone and go up and look in this valley all the way up and down it, there's probably something written in the dirt that if you're walking around on, don't even know about. In fact, it may be right where this tin is. The later hypothesis, though, is known as the Kurgan hypothesis, which comes from the name from a grave type used by the people of the region at the time, Kurgan cultures, which include the Yamnaya. Again, buried their dead in graves that were covered by dirt mounds. These cultures are thought to represent not just one migration, but many, of which the Yamnaya may have been the first, or not so, the second. These migrations are traditionally believed to have taken place between about 4000 and 1000 BC, making up something that looks like this map here. That conspicuously goes along with people of blue-eyed nature that they say start out here. For some reason they try to say, well, that's where blue eyes come from, and that's not where it is. You can see Neanderthals, and again, the ancient Cro-Magnon 30,000 year DNA shows it clearly. They're just saying the one blue eyes that come nowadays are related to this guy. Well, there are other people related to him? Yeah, they're all over the place. You see the blue-eyed statues that I talk about and show so much. Look up blue-eyed gods and you'll see it goes way into all these different cultures. Just do that and pick images. Go to DuckDuckGo, check it out. Where the Yamnaya, oh man, if this goes into part 2 here, it'll be in your top left-hand corner. I'm trying to finish. You can probably tell coffee's kicking in. The speakers of Proto-Indo-European were part of archaeologists and linguists called Proto-Indo-European or Pi culture. For now, Pi culture is largely theoretical and has been created by drawing inferences from what Proto-Indo-European words reveal about their society. For example, Proto-Indo-European words for livestock, such as sheep, goats, and cattle, are very common. It also has words for wheat and barley. This suggests that the speakers of this language were familiar with these animals and crops and may have raised them. If you take that a notch back and you say not the time we're talking about now, but the people that started forming everywhere, and you say, well, where is some suggestion of that? Well, Egypt's name for the bull, but the female bull that we call cow, C-O-W, what do they call it? Cow, K-A-W, but that's cow. That's just one in linguistics. Let's just go on. One way to cross-check the possible correlation between genetics and linguistics that might connect the Yamnaya and the Indo-European languages to look at the archaeology of Yamnaya and see if this fits with what could be predicted in Pi culture. You can pause on this if you want and take a look at it, but they're showing different variations of a theme and waves coming through. These are also languages hooked up with each one. From the far left to Carians, which also go all the way in deep China and so on. There's another group of those that they only show going left that also help to go right. Pi culture was at least partially sedentary, raising crops like wheat, barley, and probably living in wattle and daub structures, much like the ancient Shire. Based on predictions of Pi culture, this might mitigate against the idea that Pi culture can be identified with the Yamnaya. On the other hand, to go on, it is known that the Yamnaya did also practice agriculture. They had complex approach to subsistence, which included farming. It's likely once they reached Europe, they settled down and began to practice farming more settled and more often. If they adopted farming from the local non-European cultures, we would expect words related to agriculture to be foreign loan words and not in the original Proto-Indo-European lexicon. For example, there doesn't seem to be an original Pi word for sea, as we talked about in the start of this. The word for ocean or sea is not constant across many Proto-Indo-European language subgroups, and in many cases appears to have been borrowed from a foreign, possibly non-Indo-European language, as the case with Greek thalassa. Alternatively, the fact that there are original Pi words for domestic barley and wheat suggests that Pi speakers, whoever they were already familiar with farming when they became a distinct linguistic group. But then again, also, thinking about that, they did have a word for sea, which is extremely huge, large lake, and there are derivatives that come down as lake, as loch, or L-A-C, L-U-C, or L-O-C-H, like Loch Ness. If archaeologist evidence is compared to predictions about Pi society, the evidence is inconclusive but does not conflict with the hypothesis that the Yamnaya are elusive and mysterious Pi culture. This also is consistent with the discovery that the spread of Yamnaya genetic material roughly correlates with the spread of Indo-European languages into Europe and Central Asia. It does it roughly, but also looking at it in a whole haul, this had happened more than once before, but with another set of people. It had a slightly different genetics. Well, when you look into genetic trees and how it works out, it's the same damn people, and it goes back to Cro-Magnons. The origin of the first Indo-European languages, according to the Kurgan hypothesis, is about 1,000 years after the time when the Yamnaya are believed to have moved out of their homeland. So where'd they go wishy-washy? Well, but everything else seems to fit. This suggests that at least a plausible connection between the Yamnaya and the Indo-European languages, though it may not make them original speakers of Proto-Indo-European. Again, if it starts, it's in the top left-hand corner. In history, pastoralist nomads are often characterized as warlike, uncooperative barbarians, which really just meant bearded and not clean-shaven all the time. This is understandable since the people that recorded history tend to be from the sedentary agricultural societies that pastoralist nomads had a habit of raiding. It makes sense that agricultural civilizations would have dim view of these nomadic raiders and paint them in a negative light. It also is true that sometimes nomadic pastoralists are warlike, as innumerable examples in history show. Archaeological evidence does suggest, however, that ancient pastoralist nomads had another side to them. In fact, if we look at these weapons, it's really helped to use in farming and things like that. Man, I'm so close. I'm going to try to finish. They did engage in occasional raids, but there's also evidence there was significant trade and communication between different nomadic groups and farming communities. Evidence is mounting that pastoralist nomads helped to create the vast trade network stretching across Eurasia, in which goods and information were transferred. Many societies involved in this network were probably decentralized tribes and chiefdoms. Nevertheless, they helped create an intercontinental trade network that connected agricultural civilizations across the ancient world. It could be said that the first movement towards economic and cultural globalization was implemented by pastoralist nomads wandering the steppes of Central Asia. We talked about how